Hello and welcome back to another Blurble Reasoning. Today we are talking about The Final Empire, also known as Mistborn. Book 1 of Mistborn. They should never have changed the name. I have a chip on my shoulder about this. Do people still say chip on my shoulder about this? Not to immediately digress, but they changed the name of the first book of The Final Empire to Mistborn because they thought that having the first book be called The Final Empire was too confusing and would lead people to believe it was the final book. To that I say, the title The Final Empire for the first book in a series is what drew me to check out the blurb in the first place, but whatever, it's fine. Just as a heads up, because a leopard cannot change its spots or whatever, I'll probably be referring to this book as The Final Empire. It just makes it easier to differentiate between the book and the series. Now, something I want to note here is that this is my second read-through of The Final Empire. I first read through the original Mistborn trilogy all the way back in 2017, and despite fully intending to continue my read-through through Secret History and the Second Era, I allowed myself to get distracted and just let myself remain curious about what was going to happen for the next 8 years. That was very foolish. I could have got hit by a bus and never known. And in the last year or so, I've discovered Brandon Sanderson's YouTube channel, and I've been listening to his podcast, and I've been watching his lectures on writing and stuff, and I've just generally been following him, and I realized, okay, I should get back to the Cosmere. And I started that last year with Elantris, and most Brandon Sanderson fans who have read most of his works will be able to tell you that Elantris is not his best work. It's good. It's a 4 out of 5 in my opinion, but on the Sanderson scale it feels more like a 3 out of 5 just because of how good his other books feel in comparison, at least the ones I've read. And so I came into this reread with the thought of maybe I just wasn't well read enough in the genre, maybe Brandon Sanderson wasn't as good as I remember, and so I read through The Final Empire kind of looking out for those flaws or looking out for those feelings of it not hitting as hard, and I came away realizing that no, Mistborn really is just that good. This book holds up on reread, and when we get to the spoiler section of this video, I will go into why. But I do just want to say, if you've never read it before, I highly recommend The Final Empire if you like speculative fiction of any kind. The setting is unique and well realized, the characters are fantastic, they make sense. For instance, Vin specifically, one of the main characters, I feel like every action she takes and every thought she has is true to her character as presented in regards to her origins, and so it's really satisfying to see her character development over the course of a book. And you've probably heard of Brandon Sanderson's magic systems, but honestly, it's really good. Allomancy is what we find in this book, where people have the ability to use metals, and each metal has a different property as to how it can, allow the user to interact with the world. Back before I understood the term hard magic system versus soft magic system, I said in an original review of this book that it turned magic from willpower to skill in terms of fighting scenes, and it made action scenes really fun to kind of read. I was going to say watch in your mind's eye, I guess, instead of the author telling you, oh, they did this with their magic because they were able to. It's more, they did this with their magic and you understand that that is something that they would be able to do because we established the rules ahead of time and I am keeping to them. It becomes more of a tangible weapon in that sense, and it's also just really cool. There is a fight scene early on in the book where a character called Kelsier does things with a paperweight that are just diabolical. But yeah, the genre of fantasy can get a bit tropey, can feel a bit samey, so if you want something that feels unique and well realized, I would direct you to these books. I know it feels like the thing to do, I know it feels like the thing that everyone recommends you to do when you're looking at getting into fantasy, but there is also a reason why that is the case. And I've seen some people kind of turning on Brandon Sanderson a little bit in the last year or so, maybe due to the reception of Wind and Truth. I've not read that book yet, but I know some people loved it, some people did not. There might be a little bit of burnout because this man's dominated the genre for so long. People have cited reading 15 of his books back to back and then just not being able to enjoy them because they've seen too much of the same writing style for too long. Don't do that. Break it up if you're going to check out a Cosmere. Just don't take an 8-year break like I did. But also, Mistborn, like a lot of book ones of a fantasy trilogy, can be read mostly standalone. There will be things at the end of a book that leave you going, I wonder what's going to happen with that. And, if that's the case, good for you. You have free will. You can continue reading. But if you do just want to read a Brandon Sanderson book to see if it's for you, you can just read The Final Empire and get, I would say, 85% of a complete experience out of it. But I do now want to talk about what it was like to reread this book for the first time. So, spoiler alert, I am now going to be talking about not just The Final Empire, but also The Well of Ascension and The Hero of Ages. So if you just came for the spoiler-free stuff, get out! So I've said in the past that every story has two versions. The version that you first read and the version that you reread. I've also since kind of said, actually, every time you reread a story, you approach it from a new context within your life, and therefore it's always different. But in terms of difference, the amount of difference, it's mainly reading it the first time and reading it the second time, because when you read it the second time, you approach it with the foreknowledge of events to come, and you're able to appreciate things like foreshadowing. Now, as I mentioned, the first time I read this book was all the way back in 2017, so that means that this reread isn't just me going in knowing of everything that's to come, it's also refreshing my memory, because I forgot some things, and we'll get into what I forgot in a minute. But that does mean that while I did have some foreknowledge of some things to come, for instance, I see Sazed and I go, oh, it's the future god. And now I'm reading Sazed's character completely differently because I'm like, this is the man who will become god. There are also twists at the end of a book which took me by surprise a second time because it's been 8 years. The fact that the hero from the logbook was not the Lord Ruler, but Rashik was, that took me by surprise for a second time. Putting together that the Lord Ruler used ferrochemistry, that took me by surprise for a second time. Ferrochemistry itself took me by surprise for a second time. Yeah, as crazy as it sounds, something as big and important and fundamental to the story as an entire second magic system escaped my memory. Kelsia's impending doom did not, and therefore I was reading the character of Kelsia differently this entire story too, especially when he asks Sazed about the religion that people believed for the longest time into the Final Empire, the religion that survived the longest, and how it was basically built upon martyrdom. I gasped when I realized that he was asking about martyrdom. The story does make it explicit that it was something that he had been considering for some time as either a contingency plan or just the plan. But seeing it for yourself within the events of a story is something else entirely. But yeah, I would say on my first read through of the story, I was so absorbed in the world of the Final Empire with ash falling from the sky and all this stuff. I was absorbed with the magic systems and how they worked and how Brandon Sanderson changed. I mean, I don't know if he invented hard magic systems, but it was definitely the first one I ever read, right? Of changing magic from will to skill. And while some of this might just be due to time eroding my memories of the finer points of the story, I do feel like my first read-through of the series might have been a bit more surface level than this read-through of it. In this read-through, I was really able to appreciate Vin as a character and where she came from, her origins, and how that affected her behaviour moving forward, how that affected how she saw betrayal and the inevitability of it, and the way that people worked and not quite being able to trust people who are friendly to her and all this stuff. She is an exceptionally well-written character. You could argue that maybe her transformation into someone who is able to go to balls might be a little bit rushed, in terms of would someone be able to realize that they could hide behind their fake identity the minute they enter the door after living their entire life as a street urchin? But at that point, you're kind of picking at the whole suspension of disbelief, which is required for any amount of storytelling. One thing I really appreciated about this story was the nuance behind, are all nobles evil in a world that persecutes the poor? Because that's something I honestly struggle with when I think about the rich in our real world. Obviously, we don't live in the Final Empire. The Final Empire is a hyper-exaggeration of the worst-case scenario, or one of the worst-case scenarios, right? Just excessive classism and cruelty as normality. But to attempt to put this succinctly, we do live in a world with an inequality in class and wealth and injustice. And so this does mirror our world in a lot of ways. And I do really like the story that's told here with Kelsier painting all of the nobles in an evil light and wishing to kill them all, and Vin discovering that a small percentage of them might just be redeemable when they learn a little bit more about the true ways of the world. Through Elend, we learn that the nobility are taught that the Scar aren't even really people, and while that doesn't excuse the behaviour of the rich and wealthy, it does inform a lot of their decisions. And I really liked how Vin ended up teaching Kelsier by the end of the book that just flat out killing all of them was not the way to solve the problem, and that while some of them are irredeemably vile, others might be able to change their ways when taught the true ways of the world. Vin's beliefs are heralded as naive at points throughout the book, and she ends up doubting herself, and I've had a lot of that self-doubt in those kinds of ways. Like, maybe I'm just naive for agreeing with Vin, but I do like how it ended up shaking out in the book, whilst also touching on the truth of some of that naivete as well, at times when she learns that some of the people that she thought could be kind and could be good were also watching the executions with interest and glee. I think that was important too. These are not things that I was thinking about all that much on my first read through, at least not that I remember. Like, they were probably things I appreciated on some level, but clearly this is something that is more at the forefront of my mind than it used to be. I think because I was expecting the world and I was expecting the magic system, I was able to dedicate more attention to the character work and the themes of the story at its core. I also approached this from the newer context of having read more Brandon Sanderson and having watched him on YouTube and listened to his podcast and watched his lectures and stuff like that, as I mentioned earlier. And I've seen him talk about where the idea for Mistborn came from, especially with things like Vin being an outsider and that scene where she's outside the warm room and she eventually actually crosses the threshold and realizes that she belongs somewhere, and how that related to a moment within Brandon Sanderson's own life. And because of that knowledge, I found that scene all that much more important and all that much more heartfelt. You shouldn't need outside sources to tell you why scenes are important in a story, don't get me wrong, but it's definitely a bonus. I also noticed some interesting quirks of the author, such as Brandon seems to love writing a character who is going to aristocratic balls and having to do some politicking within them, perhaps having to wear a mask and not be their true self in order to do said politicking at said ball. Elantris, I'm looking at you. There are also things such as Brandon talking about how this is a heist story turned into a revolution story, and that's interesting because when I first read this book, I didn't see it framed in that kind of way. I didn't see stories as types of stories in that manner beyond fantasy, sci-fi, etc. But yeah, obviously reading through it this time, I'm like, oh yeah, it is obviously a heist story at the beginning, but still, I don't think it's as much of a heist story as he seems to put forward that it is. Also, as an aside, I recently heard Brandon Sanderson mention that compared to Dan Wells, who he does a podcast with, he is a very light-hearted guy. He had trouble writing grimdark when it was requested of him by publishers as he was trying to break into the industry, because by the end of his stories, everyone was always making friends and, friendship was leading the way and all that stuff. I gotta say, rereading this, I'm like, Brandon, you are not as light-hearted of a writer as you seem to think you are. You put the Scar through some shit, my guy. There is plenty about this book which, in a vacuum, might be considered grimdark. And knowing how this trilogy ends, it is a tragedy. I know where this is headed. It is, talking about rereading and approaching it with a new context of foreknowledge, it is really sad to hear Vin be like, I just want to belong somewhere, I just want to be part of a family, all this stuff. And know that her story ends with them all dying. Not everyone on the planet, but most people on the planet. And I remember that Elend gets beheaded and Vin dies. I think it's Caesar's POV, he sees Vin die in the background, right? And it just lends such a tragic air to the entire story knowing how it ends. But also half remembering, so bear with me. One last thing I want to talk about this story in terms of recontextualization is that this time I am listening to the audiobook version, whereas before I just read the Kindle version. This time I'm listening to the Audible version as narrated by Michael Kramer, and Michael Kramer is also one of the two people who narrated The Wheel of Time and The Stormlight Archive. And so I am very familiar with him as a narrator, and I know that I enjoy him, and I was thrilled to hear that he had done the entire Mistborn saga so far. Some people find him too dry, he's not for everyone, but he is one of my favourite narrators of audiobooks out there, and I was so excited to reread this in a new way through audiobook format, and it's been great. It's been wonderful. Honestly, it doesn't feel all that different. I think my internal monologue as I'm reading sounds similar to Michael Kramer anyway, but yeah, it was a real treat to hear Michael Kramer perform this book for me. But yeah, in general, it's just great to return to this world and rediscover why I loved it so much, with the ash falling from the sky and the Inquisitors with their wicked, twisted smiles and torturous ways, and the allomancy and the metal burning and the intrigue about, ooh, but wait, what if there's another lost metal? What could that be? What metal did they feed me to make me burn it to get rid of all the other metals and all this stuff? And also just the knowledge that there's a second era waiting for me, and that secret history is waiting for me, and I know the basic premise of secret history as well. And the fact that Brandon Sanderson, as we speak, is in the middle of writing Ghost Bloods, which is the third era for Mistborn as well. I'm just so excited, man. I read the first two Stormlight Archive books and I thoroughly enjoyed them. That was also way back in 2017, so I've also thoroughly forgotten a whole bunch of things about them. I do intend to reread those as well when I'm done with Mistborn. But I think sometimes we get so wrapped up in Stormlight Archive that we forget that Brandon has this other... I don't know if it's necessarily epic fantasy, but he has this other fantasy series, which was his original, that is what made him so famous, and rightly so. And one last thing, I also just discovered that there is a fourth book in the second era of Mistborn, which was written in 2022, 6 years after what I'm guessing was the original end of the original trilogy of the second era. And I don't want to hear a damn thing about why, but I'm so curious about that, and I'm so excited to get to it and find out what the hell is going on with that book. Because I doubt that he was just, like, took a 6-year break before finishing an expected fourth book in that series, right? Anyway, that's been my experience rereading The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, or Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, depending on what you want to call it. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble. Let me know what you think about The Final Empire and Mistborn in general down below. Keeping in mind I only have knowledge of the first 3 books, please. Actually, if I could make a request, would you mind treating this like I've not read the next 2 books? Because there are things I will have forgotten that I have forgotten, and will be really fun to rediscover, a lot like the twist that Rashik was the Lord Ruler. Like, I completely forgot about that, and it was so fun to rediscover that. I've been getting paranoid about forgetting some of my favourite stories as I age, but I'm actually realising that might be a boon because I get to rediscover them all over again. Anyway, have some bloopers. Thanks for checking this out. This book holds up on reread, and when we get to the spoiler section so I am now going to be talking spoilers not just for The Final Emperor, but putting together that the Lord Ruler used it and therefore I was reading the character of But yeah, I would say on my first read through of the world, god damn it, of changing it from skill to will, no, will to skill, shit.